we've notified you of the Families First Act requirements and the paid leave provision it applies, but you are an employee of a healthcare provider, and therefore we have chosen to exempt our employees from these requirements because of the need to continue to provide healthcare services, or we're a small business. So that way you're still meeting that Department of Labor notice of this act requirement, while also sort of tempering expectations for employees in terms of whether or not they might actually qualify for those benefits. And last but certainly not least is the tax credit. So essentially, along with passing this act with the paid leave requirements, the IRS has issued guidance stating that leave that is paid out under the Families First Act can be covered through tax credits by the employers. It's done through the payroll taxes. So essentially, employers can withhold funds that they otherwise would have deposited with the IRS for employer and employee Social Security and Medicare taxes, the employee payroll taxes. And so it should be, a sort of instantaneous, you're retaining funds that you otherwise would have paid out. If for some reason those funds are not enough to cover the leave that you're paying out, what you can do is then file a request with the IRS for advance payment, which the IRS began processing in April.
And Sarah, just to put a fine point on it, that advance payment means that instead of getting the tax credit paid on a quarterly basis, the IRS will advance it in sooner than 3 months?
That is how it should work.
Well said. Okay. All right, well, let me pause here, Dr. Hayden. We're moving on now to discuss the PPP loans and get into discussion in our last 20 minutes, answering questions and get into discussion of planning to reopen. I'd like to open up the microphone and see if anybody has any questions about emergency FMLA and emergency sick pay.
And before we go into questions, if you're not speaking, please mute your microphone. There's still a good bit of background noise. I've muted everybody that I can.
Thank you.
Marlene, Dr. Sal.
All right, with no questions then about emergency FMLA or emergency sick pay leave, we'll go into our discussion of the CARES Act. As I think most folks recognize by now, the primary component of the CARES Act is these Paycheck Protection Program or PPP loans that American businesses quickly consumed to the tune of $350 billion. We've gotten a lot of questions about how these loans are to be administered, so we really want to just cover the high points of what it takes, especially if you've been funded, what it takes to have these loans be forgiven. And then we'll move on to our discussion. So Sarah, let's try and get through these slides in the next 5 minutes or so. Oh, Sarah, you need to unmute. It looks like you've been muted.
Okay.
Good.
So the Paycheck Protection Program is administered through the Small Business Administration, a federal government agency. They ran out of their initial sort of pot of funds, and as Rich mentioned earlier, additional funds have been allocated. So we recommend sort of continuing to press for those if you haven't received them yet. We can probably move on to the next. In terms of what these PPP funds can be used for, there's a requirement that at least 75% of the funds be allocated towards payroll costs. So payroll costs include salaries, wages, commissions. Another big one is group healthcare benefits included in insurance premiums, retirement plan contributions and state and local taxes assessed on the compensation of employees. Funds that would not constitute payroll costs for purposes of the PPP loan would be compensation of an individual employee over 100,000, who makes over 100,000 per year, which translates to a little over 8,000 a month. As Zeke has mentioned before, the calculation of compensation for those employees would not include benefits. So it would just be the standard salary part that gets kind of lobbed off at 100,000. Other costs, that would be the key one. Another thing to mention though is that generally if funds are covered under one program, they wouldn't be covered under another one. So we had just discussed the Families First Act, those payroll tax credits. Funds are meant to cover Families First Act funds and obligations, so you couldn't use PPP loans to cover the leave that's paid for under the Families First Act. Outside of payroll costs, for that remaining 25%, you can use them for things like rent, mortgage interest, utilities, and business interest that you incurred prior to February 15th, 2020.
And one area we've seen some confusion on, everybody is, and this I imagine is something hopefully the banks will work out in this next round of triple P funding, is that even though these are allowable uses of triple P funds, banks aren't typically asking for proof of them in the loan application process. So the banks are asking for very detailed payroll information, payroll reports of all different stripes, but ask nothing about rent, mortgage interest, or utilities. Just be mindful that when the time comes, and we're getting to this slide next, when the time comes to ask the SBA to forgive this loan, that you'll need to have split out these costs if they're going to be included in your use of the funds.
In terms of what's required from a borrower, when you make your application, you do need to make a good faith certification that the loans are necessary due to COVID-19, that the funds will be used to retain workers, and that you do not have an application pending for a loan for similar expenses. So again, you sort of can't double dip, and you have to, we recommend opening these separate bank accounts to just make tracking easier, but you need to make sure that expenses are only applied towards one source of funding. What's not required, so certainly push back if you're asked for this, any type of collateral, personal guarantees, prepayment penalties, that the business be around for a time period beyond January 31, 2020. Tax returns aren't required, credit elsewhere isn't required.
And Zeke, we were talking a little bit about this morning. If we have members of the Academy today who are listening that have had to lay off or furlough folks, but have been one of the lucky businesses to actually apply for, get approved, and receive funding, what should they do?
You'll have to take the counterintuitive action of, so let's say you, like Rich said, you got approved for the PPP funds, where in order for it to be forgiven, you need to make sure that 75% of the loan that you received is spent on eligible payroll costs to employees. So even if your work flow or load isn't at the point where you can reasonably justify rehiring folks that you formerly employed, you still need to take that action in order to get the loan forgiveness. And even if they don't have much to do, it's a good idea to find things that a practice may put on the back burner traditionally, such as media or social media outreach, marketing materials, purging medical records, things that are tedious that folks don't enjoy doing. But that way they're just doing something where they're getting paid regardless in order for the business as the employer to get the loan forgiveness. And so if you as the employer are employing them, even if, like I said, the patient volume may not be there, you should still explore other things to keep their time full, as opposed to just paying for them to sit around.
Right. All hands on deck, right? Regardless of what their duties are. So businesses are eligible for forgiveness if they keep the same number of employees through June 30th. And so that's why, there may have been a lag in between the time, especially because so many businesses have applied for funding and just haven't heard back yet. There may be a lag in time that you had to let employees go on furlough or lay them off between then and when you find out that you've received the PPP funding. So we recommend that when you do, you go through the steps that Zeke just mentioned. Sarah, would you walk us through forgiveness, and then we'll open up to some additional questions?
Sure. So the amount of the loan, so the loan is eligible for forgiveness, to be entirely forgiven, as long as the PPP requirements are met. So you continue to provide payroll, but again, not for those you don't pay payroll out above 100,000 per employee. You continue to provide the health insurance, and you need to, another key requirement is you maintain the same number of full-time equivalent employees, and it is calculated based on FTE from February 15th, from the February to June time period. In terms of if for some reason you can't meet these requirements and the loan can't be forgiven, and you do have to repay a portion of that loan, interest, fortunately the repayment terms are still incredibly favorable compared to the average loan. So interest is capped at 1%, and the duration of the loan is 2 years. Payments are deferred up to 6 months. So the loan terms, even if it turns out that a portion does need to be repaid, are still likely to be much more favorable than other loans out there.
Exactly. Okay, so Dr. Hayden, we'll leave it here open to see if folks have any questions about the PPP loans or the next round of funding that, because